It's August 2nd, 2026. And last night, the President of the United States said something that, if it's fully accurate, is one of the more significant developments of this entire war. He said Iran came to the United States and asked it to stop. So this morning, we're going through exactly what Trump said, exactly what he's claiming Iran and other countries in the region asked for, why Israel joined this decision, and then, just as importantly, what Iran's own state media is actually saying about all of this, because there's a real gap between Washington's version of events and Tehran's public posture right now, and I think that gap is the most honest and important part of today's story. And as always, on this channel, everything here is coming directly from Trump's own social media posts, CNN, Al Jazeera, Axios, NPR, and the Washington Post. If something is one side's claim rather than a confirmed, agreed upon fact, I'm going to tell you clearly that it's a claim. Because in a story like this one, the gap between what one side says happened and what actually happened is often the entire story. So let's get into it first. Let's establish exactly what Trump said and when. Because the specific wording matters enormously here. Late Saturday night, President Trump posted on Truth Social announcing that he was canceling a planned large-scale attack on Iran. And I want to walk through his statement almost word for word because the framing he chose is doing a lot of work. He wrote that the United States is, quote, locked and loaded, and ready to go against the Islamic Republic of Iran at levels of military terror, strength, and power not seen since World War II, end quote. And then, immediately after establishing that threat, he said he had agreed to request from Iran and other Middle Eastern countries to, quote, hold off any attack in that the perimeters of a deal has been agreed to, end quote. And he added that Israel had joined him in that decision. After Iran and its regional allies requested a ceasefire, with the terms of the agreement reportedly finalized, according to his own account and separately, in comments reported by NPR, Trump said Iran and other Middle Eastern countries had specifically asked the U.S. to, quote, hold off any attack, end quote, because, quote, the perimeters of a deal has been agreed to, end quote. So that's the headline claim. In Trump's own words, Iran came asking, and the U.S. and Israel agreed to pause specifically because of that request. Now here's the detail that I think matters most. For understanding how genuine this pause actually is, Trump was explicit that this cancellation is conditional, not permanent. He said the pause remains contingent on, quote, being able to rapidly make a deal, end quote, meaning this isn't a ceasefire in the sense of a war-ending agreement. It's a bet on Washington's side that a real deal can actually be finalized quickly. And if it isn't, the planned strikes remain on the table. And Trump described what he says the actual terms of that emerging deal would include the immediate, complete, and total opening of the Strait of Hormuz, and what he called an end to Iran's nuclear threat. And I want you to sit with those two specific conditions for a second, because they are almost word for word the exact two issues that have been driving this entire war since February: unrestricted passage through the strait and the elimination of Iran's nuclear weapons capability. So if Trump's account is accurate, what's being described isn't some side agreement, it's potentially the actual core settlement. This war has been fought over from the very beginning. Now let's talk about the timing, because it tells you a lot about how close this specific moment came to a very different outcome. This announcement came just one day after U.S. media reported that Washington and Israel were actively preparing to strike Iran's energy infrastructure, and CNN separately confirmed that U.S. officials had said new strikes could take place as soon as this past weekend, and that no strikes had actually been reported from the U.S. inside Iran for several days before this announcement, following what Trump had earlier described as a, quote, heavy wave of strikes, end quote, against the country the previous Wednesday. So the actual sequence here is genuinely dramatic if you lay it out in order. A heavy wave of American strikes on Wednesday, several days of quiet, active U.S. and Israeli preparation to strike Iran's energy infrastructure specifically. Reports that a strike could come as soon as this weekend. And then, at the last possible moment, Trump announcing he's calling the whole thing off because of requests from Iran and its neighbors, and citing the emergence of a deal. Now let's talk about who else was reportedly involved in pushing for this pause, because Trump's own account suggests this wasn't purely a bilateral conversation between Washington and Tehran. Axios reported that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman spoke directly with Trump on Saturday, and specifically expressed concern over the strike plans, and that reporting came hours before Trump's own announcement. And separately, Axios noted that other regional powers, including Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Pakistan, have also been pressing both the U.S. and Iran to de-escalate. So if you take the full picture Trump and these outlets are describing together, this wasn't simply Iran alone reaching out and asking for mercy. It appears to have been a broader, genuinely multilateral regional pressure campaign, with Gulf states and other regional powers actively lobbying Washington to hold off, alongside whatever direct communication may have come from Tehran itself. And that detail actually changes the emotional framing of this story in an important way. This isn't necessarily a picture of Iran alone, isolated, begging Washington directly. It may be closer to a picture of an entire region collectively pressuring both sides to step back from the edge, with Iran being one voice among several rather than the sole party asking for a pause. Now, here's where I need to slow down and give you the other half of this story properly, because it is genuinely the most important part of today's video. And it's the part that a lot of coverage chasing the dramatic headline is going to skip past entirely. Iranian state media, as of this morning, has given no indication that Tehran actually asked for the attacks to be called off, and has not changed its public stance on the Strait of Hormuz at all. That's not my own analysis. That's the direct reporting from CNN's own live coverage of this exact story, and I think it's worth reading that sentence again slowly, because it sits in real tension with this version of events Trump described. The President of the United States is saying, publicly, that Iran asked the U.S. to stop, and Iran's own state media, covering the exact same news cycle, is not confirming that Tehran made any such request, and has not acknowledged any softening of its position on the strait, the single issue that's been the flashpoint of this entire war. And separately, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi's own public statements this same weekend read far. Closer to defiance than to a plea for mercy, he warned off both the U.S. and Israel from any further action, saying directly, quote, "Any hostile action by the U.S. or Israel, or participation or cooperation by regional countries in such actions, would be met with a decisive and proportionate response from Iran's powerful armed forces," end quote. And in a separate call with Saudi Arabia's foreign minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan al Saud, Araghchi said Iran would respond decisively and proportionally to, quote, "any aggression," end quote, from the U.S., Israel, or other countries in the region. And just the week before, Araghchi had specifically described Iran's defense strategy in blunt terms, calling it an, quote, "eye for an eye," end quote, response to any attacks on its infrastructure. So you have the American president describing Iran as having come asking for a pause, and in that exact same window, Iran's own foreign minister publicly promising decisive, proportional retaliation against any further American or Israeli action. Those two things are not obviously compatible on their face, and I think the honest read here is one of two possibilities. Either there is a genuine, quiet diplomatic track happening through intermediaries, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, that Iran's own public-facing officials aren't acknowledging for domestic political reasons, because openly admitting you asked your enemy to stop bombing you is a genuine vulnerability for a regime that has spent this entire war projecting strength and defiance. Or, alternatively, Trump's characterization of events is more optimistic or more generous to his own negotiating position than what's actually been agreed to on the ground. And without independent confirmation from Tehran itself, I don't think we can fully resolve which of those two explanations is closer to the truth this morning. What I can tell you with confidence is that the gap between the two public narratives is real, documented, and worth taking seriously rather than papering over. Now let's talk about what's happening on the ground, regardless of who's framing. You believe, because this part is more straightforwardly confirmed, no strikes were reported from either the Iranian or the U.S. side overnight following this announcement, according to CNN's live coverage. So whatever the actual diplomatic reality is underneath the competing statements, the practical physical result, as of this morning, is a genuine pause in the fighting, at least for this specific stretch of hours, and that matters on its own terms regardless of exactly how it came about. Now, even with that pause holding overnight, I want to give you the fuller picture of how tense this exact moment actually is, because it's not a picture of calm. The State Department issued a fresh travel warning to Americans across the Middle East just before this announcement, specifically telling citizens they should consider departing the region now and separately. Tehran issued new threats to countries that host American military bases, and Kuwaiti authorities reported Iranian drone attacks early Saturday. So the backdrop to this entire cancellation announcement is a region that was actively bracing for expanded conflict, not one that had already settled into calm. The pause came at what genuinely looks like close to the last possible moment before a much larger escalation. Now let's back up and give you the broader arc of how we got to this exact point, because I think it helps explain why both the dramatic pause and the skepticism around it make sense simultaneously. The last major diplomatic breakthrough in this war came back in June, when the U.S. and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding specifically aimed at pausing the fighting while both sides negotiated a lasting end to the war, and that memorandum eventually broke down. Following clashes centered specifically on the Strait of Hormuz, which led directly to the resumption of the American naval blockade and a renewed, expanded regional conflict, and CNN's own timeline of how this specific round of fighting resumed is worth knowing. On July 1st, U.S. and Iranian negotiators traveled to Doha, Qatar, for indirect negotiations, and the delegations reportedly made what Qatar's foreign ministry spokesperson described as, quote, positive progress, end quote. And then, on July 7th, Iran fired on 3 commercial vessels in Oman's territorial waters near the Strait of Hormuz, and that single event is what actually reignited the entire war after the June ceasefire had briefly held. So if you zoom out and look at the full shape of this conflict since June, the pattern Trump himself described in an interview just days before this latest announcement is genuinely accurate. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, "We hit them very hard. They ask us not to do it, and they want to negotiate. We start negotiating. In the midst of a negotiation, they fire 5 rockets at us, we knock all of them down, and then we beat the hell out of them, like last night. We beat the hell out of them, and we're not stopping either," end quote. And that cycle strikes, then a pause for talks, then some kind of Iranian provocation during those talks, then a heavier American response, then eventually another pause, has now repeated itself multiple times since June. This latest cancellation is, structurally, another iteration of that exact same pattern, which is precisely why I think a healthy amount of skepticism about how durable it will actually be is warranted, even while the news itself, a major planned attack genuinely called off at the last minute, is significant regardless of how long it holds. Now let's touch on something Trump said earlier in the week that's worth bringing into this picture, because it adds an interesting layer to the broader story of America's own position in this war. Trump acknowledged that the U.S. would like to have more sophisticated munitions as the war in Iran draws down its stockpiles, though he insisted the military has what it needs to continue waging the conflict. And separately, he acknowledged that Russia may be helping Iran by passing along intelligence on U.S. bases, a claim we've covered on this channel before through Zelensky's own allegations, but Trump largely brushed off the significance of that Russian assistance, saying, quote, "It hasn't had much impact because we're knocking the hell out of them," end quote. So even the American president himself is publicly acknowledging 2 things that complicate the simple triumphant version of this story: that sustained munition stockpiles are becoming a real practical concern after 5 months of continuous combat, and that Russia may in fact be providing Iran with intelligence assistance, even while insisting that assistance hasn't meaningfully changed the outcome on the battlefield. All right, let's bring this all the way back together and give you the honest, complete strategic read on where this leaves us this morning, because that's what I've tried to do consistently on this channel. Here's the picture. As of today, President Trump says he canceled a major planned attack on Iran's energy infrastructure after Iran and other regional countries asked for a pause, citing the emergence of a deal whose core terms would include fully reopening the Strait of Hormuz and ending Iran's nuclear threat. Israel joined that decision, and Saudi Arabia. Qatar, the UAE, Turkey, and Pakistan all appear to have played some role in pushing for de-escalation over the preceding days. And as of this morning, no strikes have been reported from either side. So a real physical pause is genuinely holding right now. But Iran's own state media has not confirmed that Tehran asked for this pause at all, has not acknowledged any change in its position on the strait, and Iran's foreign minister spent the same weekend publicly promising decisive, proportional retaliation against any further American or Israeli action. Rather than publicly embracing the conciliatory framing coming out of Washington, that gap between the 2 sides' public narratives is real and unresolved this morning. And given the exact same cycle, strikes, pause, provocation, heavier strikes, has already repeated itself multiple times since this war's June ceasefire. First collapsed, the honest, appropriately cautious read is that this latest pause is genuinely significant. A real attack was really called off at what looks like close to the last possible moment, but it is not yet confirmed as a durable turning point. It's contingent by Trump's own explicit description on a deal being reached rapidly, and if the pattern of the last 2 months holds, that deal either gets finalized in the coming days or this exact cycle repeats itself again. So here's what I want to know from you this morning, given that Iran's own state media isn't confirming Trump's version of events. Do you think Tehran genuinely reached out through back channels and just isn't saying so publicly for its own political reasons? Or do you think Trump's framing here is more generous to his own position than what Iran has actually agreed to? Let me know exactly what you think down in the comments.